Good day, everyone. I would like to introduce myself, Chris Martin, contract negotiator at Rutgers State University, and Jennifer Welch, director of research contracting at Brown University, the new co-chairs to the FTP Data Stewardship Subcommittee. We are very proud to warmly welcome you to the FTP session titled Update on Implementation of the NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy. In this session, we will receive updates from NIH on their implementation plan for the NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy that will be effective starting on January 25th, 2023. Also, we will be reserving time to answer any questions that are posed to the presenters using the Q&A feature available. Today, we have with us Taunton Page and Cindy Danielson from NIH. Taunton is the director of the Scientific Data Sharing Policy Division in the Office of Science Policy and has been with OSP since 2011. His division is responsible for issues relating to data sharing policy, including issuance of the recent NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy, the NIH Genomic Data Sharing Policy, and management of the NIH Data Science Policy Council. He holds a dual master's degree from Columbia University and London School of Economics and Political Science. Cindy is Associate Director, Systems Integration in the Office of Research Reporting and Analysis, which is part of the Office of Extramural Research at NIH. Cindy supports the management of reporting tools used for program management and analysis by NIH staff and the public, and coordinates policy implementation plans. She received her PhD in cell and molecular biology from Northwestern University, where she focused on the cell biology of HIV and host cell defenses, and her undergraduate degree in psychobiology from the University of Southern California. I want to thank both Taunton and Cindy for their time and efforts in presenting on this pressing topic. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Taunton and Cindy.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. So I'm Taunton Payne. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today with my colleague, Cindy Danielson. And we're going to be going over the recently issued NIH policy for data management and sharing and some of the implementation activities. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a quick overview of our plan for today. So first, I think what I'll do is I'll sort of go over how we kind of arrived at the policy and sort of the kind of evolution of NIH data sharing policies over time and the specific sort of development process that we went through in issuing this policy. Then I'll talk a bit about what's in the policy itself in terms of the specific expectations in the policy and the related supplemental information that were published alongside it. And then I will turn it over to my colleague Cindy, and she'll go through some of the implementation activities that the Office for Extramural Research has planned and some of those next steps. And then I will take it back and talk about some of the activities that the Office of Science Policy also has planned. And then I think I'll sort of conclude by going over some of the outreach activities that we've done and some of the other things that we see going on in the space. And then hopefully we'll have sort of plenty of time for discussion at the end. I'll share some of what we've been hearing as well, but I think we're also quite interested in hearing what you had to say. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. And we have some questions I think of our own for this community as well. So next slide, please. So why has NIH issued this policy? What are we trying to achieve with this? I think if you look at data sharing policies in general, what you'll find is that they can be motivated by sort of any number of reasons, which can sort of influence what they look like. In this particular case, for the data management and sharing policy, I think there's sort of two major categories of goals that NIH is trying to achieve here. So first is, we really want to advance rigorous and reproducible research, and we want to do that by sharing data to enable validation of research results. I think an additional goal that comes from that is that when you, make high-value data sets that there may be sort of substantial public investment in, actually accessible to people for, future research use, you do allow questions to be asked that were not necessarily part of the original study design, which helps to accelerate, future research directions. And of course, making data available increases opportunities for citation, both of the data itself, which is something we're sort of very interested in seeing in order to sort of recognize people's contribution in this area, but also of the primary work that they underlie. And it also helps to facilitate collaboration between researchers. I think a sort of second category of goal that we're hoping to see occur here is in the sort of category of trying to promote public trust in publicly funded research. So I think part of the way we want to try and achieve that is by fostering transparency and accountability in the research activities that we support. And partly this is to help sort of demonstrate good stewardship over taxpayer funds. It shows that what sort of came out of that activity. And then I think there's a sort of common sort of ethical argument made here as well, that sharing data helps to sort of maximize research participants' contributions, especially in light of the sacrifices that they sometimes make to participate in research. And of course, any publication of a data sharing policy also presents an opportunity to sort of reiterate or to actually establish new protections for research participants' data as well. Next slide, please. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that NIH thinks that scientific data sharing is new, or that this is some sort of new topic we've kind of come across. Here is, for example, Robert Boyle's data from 1662 that underlined Boyle's law. Certainly sharing data sort of underlies the scientific process, and we think that's been true sort of all along. But I think there is sort of a growing expectation in this area, and it's one that you can certainly see sort of reflected in the long arc of data sharing policies. Next slide, please. So, particularly I think in the sort of recent history, going back over the last 30 or 40 years or so, what you will see if you look at the historical record is an incremental growth in data sharing expectations at NIH and in the federal government. It's not necessarily always, towards more sort of openness. And indeed, if you go back to 1980, there's certainly kind of a landmark Supreme Court case in the aftermath of a very large NIH-funded study in which there were very sort of impactful findings that were then used as the basis of FDA action. And in that particular case, I think the outcome was not one that went necessarily towards more openness and sharing. But for NIH's part, I think you can clearly see sort of a long-term trend towards greater sharing expectations across the agency. So in 1988, which is really sort of one of the kind of earliest examples, the policy on distribution of research resources set up expectations for the sharing of those things, which included both specimens and information, in particular things like crystallography data and DNA sequences, and expected that these would be shared after publication. And in what I think is sort of a similar pattern to what you see today, many NIH institutes and centers will also establish their own policies that sort of reflect their programmatic priorities or their scientific discipline's needs. And so in 1989, you have NHLBI, part of NIH, established a policy that really focused on clinical trials, epidemiological studies, and other sort of large-scale studies, and expected data to be shared from them within 3 years of major publication. And really, the point here was to try and maximize the federal government's investment in research. Next slide, please. I think through the 1990s, what you see is certainly a kind of acceleration in terms of data sharing expectations. So in 1996, I think you see the field of genomics kind of get out ahead of everybody else, at least for a time, in the sort of international declaration of Bermuda principles that expected sort of immediate and broad sharing of data. That's something that I think continues to sort of define the genomics field, but is now not something that is necessarily just unique to it. And we're certainly seeing that kind of expectation more and more. And then also, Congress has increasingly been sort of getting into this space. And in 1997, they passed a law that established clinicaltrials.gov, and was sort of like important step towards the registration and sharing of results from clinical trials. And then, I think there was sort of a landmark case as well, where there was a very large NIH-funded study that had sort of very impactful findings for public health that were, again, used as the basis of federal regulation. And so as a result of that, there was great interest in being able to sort of see the data that, underlie those findings. Various groups tried to get access to them. They were denied. And those findings were actually replicated independently later. But Congress, in the sort of aftermath of this public debate, stepped in and passed a law that was sort of later interpreted to say that all federally funded research data underlying regulations must be made publicly available. And I think that is sort of the beginning of a broad consensus that data underlying publicly funded studies should be made available. And this I think is sort of a key point in which things began to accelerate maybe a little bit more. So next slide, please. Certainly not long after that, we had the NIH Data Sharing Policy from 2003. Many of you may be familiar with that one. That one is still technically in effect today. What it says is that it expects that for any applications requesting $500,000 or more per year, that a data sharing plan would be submitted with the application for funding. There's sort of similar expectations on the intramural side as well. I think the next major sort of group of policies to come along were the genomic data sharing policies in 2007 and 2015 that established the expectation for sharing of large-scale genomic data from studies that we fund, and sort of have specific expectations around repositories and consent, and set up a whole framework for sort of secondary access to those data. The intramural program at NIH has also had a policy in place since 2015 to promote the sharing of human participant data. And in 2016, NIH also issued a policy that sort of expanded the existing regulatory requirements for registration and submission of results from clinical trials to clinicaltrials.gov. This is not necessarily a kind of data sharing that we always think of that way, but I think it is certainly a type of data sharing that helps to sort of promote transparency and openness. Next slide, please. I do want to just give you a sense of the other sort of NIH institute, center, or office-specific policies that may exist. So certainly we've already talked about NHLBI's policy. NIMH has a similar policy, and both of these ones point to their own sort of respective repositories as the preferred avenue for sharing. There's also a sort of multi-NIH institute and center policy for sharing of autism data that's been around for a couple of years. And then sometimes certain programs will also establish their own policies, such as the NCI Cancer Moonshot Public Access and Data Sharing Policy. Next slide, please. So I think the sort of more recent history is that if you look back for the sort of proximal origin of this policy, I think the 2013 Holdren memo is really a good place to start. So that was when the White House issued a memo to all departments and agencies saying that they needed to come up with plans to increase public access to the results of federally funded research. And they meant that to include both publications and the data that underlie them. Next slide, please. So really, the first time that I think NIH sort of signaled its intent to revise the 2003 data sharing policy was in 2015, when we actually issued that plan that was called for by the Holdren memo. And I think that sort of started us down a path of a very substantial consultative and sort of iterative policy development process here. where we went out and got public comment repeatedly. So we issued an RFI on strategies on sort of data management, sharing, and citation in 2016. In 2018, we used that input to form the basis of an additional sort of request for comment on various specific provisions of a draft policy. Again, used that feedback in turn to actually develop the draft policy itself and sort of accompanying supplemental information, which was released for public comment in November 2019. We got about 200 public comments on that. Those were read and analyzed very carefully and used to inform the final policy that was issued in October 2020 with an effective date of January 2023. I'll talk more about that a bit later. We also went through a formal tribal consultation process, which is a sort of specific process where we pulled together multiple groups across the country to sort of meet with tribal leaders to explain the policy and what we were trying to accomplish and to hear their concerns and their input. There's a report on our website about that process and how we used that input, and I'll say more about that later as well. We also, had some coordination with other departments and agencies, typically under the National Science and Technology Council. And the draft report was also the subject of a number of recommendations from the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections. And we paid, I think, very close attention to those and made a number of changes in the final policy in response to those. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the policy itself and some of the expectations in it and the supplemental information. Next slide, please. So the policy for data management and sharing is itself, I think, pretty straightforward. Fundamentally, what it has is sort of two core requirements. So the first is an expectation for the submission of a data management and sharing plan to be submitted with the application for funding for all NIH-funded research. And when I say all NIH-funded research, what I mean is grants, cooperative agreements, contracts, other transaction authorities, even the intramural research program, all will be under this set of expectations. And that plan will describe sort of how, where, and when we expect people to sort of share data. And then second, we would expect applicants to actually comply with the plan that they've provided to us that was approved by the funding institute, center, or office. We, I think, have been pretty clear in the policy that we're serious about compliance, and that compliance with the plan, compliance with the policy can factor into future funding decisions. As I mentioned, it's actually effective on January 25th, 2023, at which point it will replace the 2003 data sharing policy. We've published 3 supplemental information documents alongside the policy on different topics, which I'll go into as well, that are sort of there to help people understand what the expectations of the policy are and how to comply with it. And going back to my first slide about what I said about sort of the goals of this policy, I think the sort of specific goal here is to sort of foster a better culture of sort of data stewardship in order to promote stronger data management and data sharing practices. Next slide, please. So just, for those of you who might be familiar with the 2003 data sharing policy, I thought it was worth going over a little bit of the differences between them. So, we've already discussed this, but obviously the scope of the 2003 policy is that it has a threshold of $500,000 or more per year in order to be triggered. The 2020 policy does not have that. It just applies to all awards that are generating scientific data. They're fairly similar in terms of their definition of what sort of constitutes scientific data, but the data to share under the 2003 policy are the sort of final research data, whereas I think the 2020 policy has an important distinction here in that it also applies to the sort of sharing of data that may not underlie a publication. in terms of the expectations for how to share data, the 2003 policy is pretty flexible and really sort of instructs people to tell us what their plans are, and I think maybe a little outdated at this point in terms of highlighting some of the specific options that are available to people, like mailing a hard disk or something. Whereas the 2020 policy, I think, has a much more sort of specific set of expectations that are actually to be detailed in the plan, and we can get into that. And then there's also in the 2003 policy, there's really not much in the way of detail when it comes to what the sort of data sharing plan elements should include, whereas in the 2020 policy, there is actually quite a bit of detail. And I want to just focus for a second on the effective date and what that means. So really what the effective date means is that this policy will apply for new and competing applications submitted for the January 25th, 2023 receipt date and after, at which point it will replace the 2003 policy for those applications going forward. So there will be a sort of rolling basis under which things come under this policy. Next slide, please. There's a couple of details that I want to, kind of draw your attention to here, because I think they're very important for understanding how this policy works. So first, the scope here is that this really applies to all NIH supported research. And again, we talked about supported, it's everything essentially. All NIH supported research generating scientific data. And scientific data are defined very explicitly in the policy as being the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate the research findings, regardless of whether these data are used to support scholarly publications or not. And there is a specific sort of carve out here from this definition that we don't want things like lab notebooks, preliminary analyses, peer reviews, or physical objects. This policy does not apply to things like biospecimens or gels or instruments. It does get into some detail about sort of timelines for sharing data. So in terms of when data should be made available, what the policy says is that should occur no later than the time of publication of the findings that those data underlie, or by the end of the award for data that have not yet been published. And then in terms of how long data should be shared for once they have been made available, what we do is we don't necessarily provide a specific, date or sort of time period that they should be made, available for, but we do ask people to consider what other, relevant requirements and expectations they may be subject to from other sources, such as, repository policies or sort of record retention requirements. Typically grants have a 3-year record retention requirement. Contracts often have 6 years, or things like journal policies as well, as being sort of the sort of minimum time frame that people should consider for making their data actually available for. Next slide, please. There's some expectations in plans that I'd like to go over here, and I think this is kind of important, especially because some of these changes were changes that were made, following comments received on the draft policy and from other sources. So the policy expects the submission of a plan describing how, where, and when data will be shared in compliance with that plan. What the policy does not say is that it requires data sharing. That's not something that's in the policy. But what it does say is that we expect that when people are writing plans, that they will approach them with the sort of default stance of data sharing, that they will attempt to maximize, while drafting their plans, appropriate data sharing, recognizing, of course, that there may be cases where it is not necessarily practical, appropriate, or even permissible to share data. So there are certain areas where there may be, well justified, I think, exceptions to sharing data that or that may limit the sharing of data to some degree. So these include ethical, legal, and sort of technical factors for reasons why data cannot be sort of fully openly shared. And then I think the policy is pretty clear that it's the data management and sharing policy. So we really expect that all data should be managed, but not all data should necessarily be shared. I think there's also an important emphasis in the policy on wanting to ensure responsible implementation of data management and sharing plans. So plans should absolutely include in them, an outline of how they're planning to, protect the privacy rights and confidentiality of research participants. If the plan relates to sort of human data. And I want to be really clear in sort of saying this next part that there's nothing in the policy that changes the applicability of existing laws, regulations, or policies. All of those will continue to apply, including in some cases other NIH policies that may set expectations that may be more aggressive or detailed in some cases than what this policy sets. Those would continue to be in place, and we would expect compliance with both sets of expectations. And we also say, I think throughout the policy, that we really, a big motivation behind a number of the features of the policy is really to get people to plan prospectively for data management and sharing. So for example, the application should be included, the plan should be included with the application for funding, which is a way to sort of ensure that people are thinking about, some of these decisions early on, and as part of the actual research design process. What that means, of course, is that they will occur upstream of a number of other decisions that they have to make. And so I think a situation that we really are trying to avoid is where people will perhaps make promises to us in their plans that they then get to other parts of the research process later and realize they may not be able to actually implement. And in particular, we want people, as they're writing their data management and sharing plans, to think very carefully about how they're going to sort of communicate what they're telling us to research participants in the informed consent, to ensure that there's not sort of a mismatch between what they've said to us and what might people actually agree to. And then I think something else that we've said, in the course of the policy as well, is that we strongly encourage people to consider submitting their data to controlled access repositories for human data, even if they're sort of de-identified, to ensure that the subsequent secondary uses are actually appropriate. Next slide, please. So one of the supplemental information documents I want to go over here now, I think is actually really useful, which is the sort of elements of a data management and sharing plan. So what this does is it really goes through in some detail what NIH would expect a data management and sharing plan to include in it. And it lays out all those elements, and it also says that in general we would expect these plans to be not more than about 2 pages. So it has a number of specific elements. For example, we want people to tell us about what sort of data they're planning to generate, and which data will be sort of preserved and shared, whether there are any kind of related tools, software, or code that will be needed to kind of access and manipulate the data, as well as any kind of standards that they're going to be collecting these scientific data under, as well as for any kind of metadata that will also be shared with these data. There's also sort of a section for data preservation access and timelines, and this is really where we want people to tell us what repository are you going to use, what kind of persistent unique identifiers are going to be attached to this work or to the data that result from it. When the data are going to be made available and sort of how long they will be made available for. And then there's a whole section also on sort of access, distribution, and reuse considerations. And this is where I think we really would expect people to be telling us about limitations on secondary research use, that may stem from some of the factors that we discussed before, for example, ethical, or technical factors that may require limiting distribution, for some purposes. And then last, I think we also sort of ask people to tell us, who's going to be responsible for this plan, and how is it going to actually, be sort of implemented. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the other supplemental information documents, and interestingly, this one was actually sort of initially developed by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and put out through kind of a separate public comment process by them, but we sort of adopted it and took it on sort of as our own. So I think it's a great example of where federal agencies sort of collaborate together to have sort of consistent standards. I think something important to understand about the policy is that what it says is that we really want to push people to use repositories as the preferred method of sharing data. Oftentimes, obviously, what you hear are things like, my data will be available upon reasonable request. We would like really to push people towards the use of established public repositories to the extent that they can, as this really helps to improve the sort of fairness of the data, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. We don't necessarily try and limit people to just NIH supported repositories or anything like that. And there's a number of sort of specific characteristics in this supplemental information that are actually intended to help people sort of understand what makes a good repository, since that's certainly a question that I think we received a lot during the sort of development process of the policy. So for example, for human data, it lays out a couple of characteristics that people should be looking for. So for example, the ability of the repository to ensure that secondary uses have some sort of fidelity to the consent, that there's restricted uses, that there's appropriate privacy protections in plan, and things for like reviewing requests for the data and things like that. And then I think kind of more generally, there's other characteristics as well that would apply both to non-human data too, relating to the use of sort of persistent unique identifiers, whether it can kind of facilitate attached metadata and has sort of quality assurance processes actually in place. Obviously, it links to a list of NIH supported repositories that we make available on our website. Obviously, we don't necessarily expect that people use one of those, because this policy does not say you have to use any particular repository. But NIH institutes and centers may through their own policies and expectations, or even through sort of programmatic expectations, point to sort of specific policies, repositories. So as an example, the Genomic Data Sharing Policy typically points people towards NIH designated genomic data repositories, which traditionally has often been DBGAP. Okay, so I think for the next section, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Cindy Danielson, and she'll pick up on the next supplemental information.
Great, thanks. So supplemental information is also available on allowable costs, highlighting what types of costs can be considered data management and sharing costs allowed in budget requests and what are not. Costs allowed in budget requests would include things like curating data, developing supporting documentation, preserving and sharing data through repositories, and local data management considerations. While costs that cannot be considered part of data management and sharing would include infrastructure costs typically included in direct costs, costs associated with the routine conduct of research, and so on. And there are some additional details in the supplemental information document on allowable costs. The link for this is included at the end of the presentation, which will be shared. Next slide, please. So next, I want to give an overview of how data management and sharing plans will be submitted and reviewed. The details described here are specific to extramural grant awards, but there will be analogous requirements put in place for other types of funding, such as contracts and intramural research projects. The policy expects that plans outlining how scientific data will be managed or shared will be submitted with the application for funding, and specifically as part of the budget justification section. In terms of review, peer reviewers may only comment on the proposed budget for data management and sharing, but these comments will not impact the score. The plans themselves will undergo programmatic assessment by NIH as determined by the proposed institute or center. And as the project progresses, plans should be updated by researchers and assessed by NIH program staff during regular reporting intervals or sooner. Once an award is made, compliance with the approved plan will become a term and condition of award, and compliance will be monitored at regular reporting intervals. The mechanisms and tools to support this oversight are currently under development. The policy states that compliance may factor into future funding decisions, so institutions will need to take these plans seriously. Next slide, please. Next, we'll turn to implementation activities and next steps and talk about some of our plans and considerations as we work to implement the policy. Next slide, please. In addition to reaching out to the community to understand implementation challenges, we're also working across the NIH to implement the policy in a way that will work for all types of science, all institutes and centers, and the NIH staff and external organizations who will all have roles to play related to data management and sharing. A large part of the implementation effort is working out the technical approaches to support the policy, and we are thinking through approaches and workflows to implement the policy in a way that will help to advance the rigor and reproducibility of NIH-supported research. In terms of how the plans will be assessed, we're focusing on determining the appropriate roles, responsibilities, and processes by which NIH institutes and centers will assess plans. We're also thinking through what information and tools are needed to help ensure that awardees adhere to the plans that were approved and that the community has access to any data that should have been shared. As the policy allows for non-compliance with the approved plan to affect future funding, we are also thinking through the needs around monitoring institutional compliance. All of this will certainly involve system changes, and we are working to determine requirements for enhancing award management systems and developing tools both for the community and for NIH to support the entire process, from submission of plans to their programmatic assessment, all the way through monitoring for compliance with the plans that were approved and updated as things change. We are also determining approaches for posting plans publicly to ensure that they are useful to researchers looking to find data generated through the use of NIH funding that may have been shared. We want to do this in a way that encourages researchers to share reusable data and adopt good data sharing practices. So we're making sure to engage with data science colleagues across NIH and in the community as we consider how to link out to repositories, employ persistent identifiers, and promote fair data principles. We will also be developing guidance, so investigators and institutions will be prepared to comply with the policy, and NIH staff will be prepared to provide oversight and guidance for the community. Next slide, please. While the policy does not go into effect until January 2023, I want to share some questions we've received about implementation, which highlight some areas of consideration that have been raised and which we are thinking through as part of our implementation efforts. Some questions focus around how information in a data management and sharing plan will be captured, such as, will there be a template to submit plans? Will the plans be submitted as a free text document, or will some elements be collected in a structured form to enhance consistency and facilitate assessment? What information will peer reviewers need to determine whether the budget is reasonable? Other questions focus around how to promote consistency, minimize redundant plans, and ensure accountability, such as what types of applications will need to submit a plan and how will exceptions be handled? Will awards subject to multiple data sharing policies need to submit multiple plans? How will plan submission and compliance for multi-site network studies be handled? Other questions relate to what guidance will be offered to help applicants prepare plans, such as what criteria will be used to assess the appropriateness of a plan. We've also received many questions related to how NIH will monitor policy compliance and handle non-compliance, such as how will institutional non-compliance be handled during the award and after. These are all areas we're thinking through carefully as we work to implement the policy, and will be addressed as part of our implementation efforts and will be shared broadly with the community. If there are other questions or points we should consider, we'd encourage you to enter them into the Q&A interface so we can follow up on them. And now I will turn things back to Taunton to discuss NIH's plans for other resources for implementation.
Great, thank you, Cindy. So, in terms of some of the topics that the Office of Science Policy has been thinking about, for implementation, we're obviously working very closely, with the Office for Extramural Research as well. There's a number of sort of different areas for implementation that we're focusing. So, first we've been doing a lot of outreach. I think this presentation is a good example, and we're also hoping to kind of develop additional supplemental information, which I'll talk about in a second. I think we're also really interested in what sort of resources we might be able to develop to help sort of inform data management and sharing cost estimates. There was sort of a kind of recent NIS report, looking at sort of forecasting costs of sort of data management and sharing from 2020. And we certainly heard a lot about that in the 2021 workshop that we hosted earlier this year, which I'll mention again. And then I think, a sort of area that we are really interested in is understanding, what we might be able to do to sort of incentivize, good sort of data sharing practices and to make people sort of want to share data rather than to have to kind of rely on sort of, policy compliance and things like that. And then, in terms of some of the sort of burden reduction, areas that we've been looking at, certainly we're aware, and this is a comment that we received, that there can be sometimes a confusing landscape of data sharing expectations at NIH. We're certainly, I think, very aware of that. And so one of the things that we want to try and do is to help sort of clarify interactions, between these policies, and to sort of, potentially take a hard look at where we might be able to kind of harmonize and streamline our expectations. And then I think there's also sort of more sort of typical, kind of resources that I think we want to try and develop in the context of this policy. So in particular, things like frequently asked questions and other kinds of resources to help people better understand, what do we mean by certain concepts in the policy, and to help people sort of, actually implement and to understand the expectations. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that we have kind of on our agenda here is to make sure that we kind of follow through on the results of the tribal consultation. So the policy was modified to note, sort of our kind of emphasis on respect for tribal sovereignty, and we are actually trying to develop a supplemental information that will incorporate some of the things that we heard, which is really intended to be used by sort of researchers and tribes to sort of facilitate respectful partnership between tribes and sort of AN communities and researchers, to make sure that they're all sort of working on the same page when it comes to what the goals of data management and sharing are, and how to sort of do those appropriately while respecting tribal sovereignty. And this is something that we're currently working on and hope to be able to release in sort of final version relatively soon. Next slide, please. I think we're also really interested in kind of being able to, assess the effectiveness of a policy. This was a big topic at the National Academies workshop, earlier this year. This is one of my sort of, favorite areas to kind of think about with the policy. Certainly we always want to understand, how do we, make sure that our policies are, actually achieving their goals. And I think, there's a couple of sort of short-term goals that we're thinking about, and sort of long-term goals as well. And I think we're I think very interested in sort of understanding, what does the community think successful implementation of this policy should sort of look like, and what kind of things should we be thinking about, sort of measuring, obviously just sort of measuring, increased sort of data sharing and, traffic and use will only really get us so far in terms of understanding whether this policy is really, achieving its goals. But certainly that is I think an area, that we've heard there is some interest in. Next slide, please. So, I mentioned earlier, our interest in wanting to sort of explore options to help incentivize data sharing, to kind of bring people to a point where, they really feel like the, incentives actually are ones that promote data sharing. One way in which I think we are hoping that we may be able to contribute to that is by sort of considering, our options for promoting usage, greater usage of sort of persistent, identifiers for sort of data assets, to facilitate sort of fair data sharing. Also, I think it has a benefit for us in terms of, wanting to do sort of policy compliance monitoring. I think in addition to the use of sort of persistent identifiers, I think we're also interested in, what other kind of mechanisms might exist to help encourage data citation. Because I think we certainly are, very interested in making sure that people's contribution when they share data gets sort of recognized, and that can factor into all sorts of, decisions that are important for sort of career progression as well. Next slide, please. So to kind of come back to this issue of sort of harmonizing data sharing policies across, NIH and wanting to kind of address, whatever burden might be sort of, introduced by this. I do just want to show, a quick kind of comparison here between the GDS policy that we've had in place for a long time and the data management and sharing policy. I've certainly, I think, heard some assumptions that people think that the genomic data sharing policy will be totally subsumed by the data management and sharing policy. That's not really our sort of understanding of how these policies will work together. So there are, I think, some kind of key sort of differences here. So obviously the data management and sharing policy applies for all NIH supported research that's generating scientific data, whereas the GDS policy has a kind of more narrow focus. So we don't really think there should be a lot of cases where things are subject to the genomic data sharing policy that are not also subject to the data management and sharing policy. But I think where they start to diverge a little bit is in terms of things like their timeline for sharing. So they both do sort of look at publication as being kind of a key event for making data available. But in some cases for human data, the GDS policy can sort of expect more aggressive timelines, things like certain levels of data processing might be expected to be shared as early as 3 months after data generation, and that is certainly a difference with the data management and sharing policy. There are planned elements expected for the GDS policy, but they are different and to some extent, I think, less extensive than those expected under the data management and sharing policy. The plan review is roughly equivalent, but there are differences in terms of the repository selection. So obviously the DMS policy is somewhat open, whereas the GDS policy is rather targeted. I think another important thing here to understand is that we really don't want people to have to submit 2 plans to describe what would effectively be the same set of activities. So we're certainly looking at where we might be able to streamline compliance and to sort of reduce burden of complying with these policies, and also just make it a lot easier to understand what are the data sharing expectations that are on any particular application for funding. So I would say I think in this particular case stay tuned. There may be more information forthcoming soon here. Next slide, please. So there's some other, examples of questions and feedback that we've gotten as well on the policy. And some of these things are, like they're certainly all things that we're sort of considering. I think, we may not sort of issue, clarification, around every question we receive. But sort of certainly, I think we're interested in sort of identifying those most frequently asked questions, and sort of issues that are quite confusing, to people. So we do want to try and address those. Obviously, there's been questions about kind of what's certain terms used in the policy and things like that, and we can try and address some of those things. I think we've gotten questions about sort of unpublished data, and what are those kind of data types, whether NIH plans to provide, more sort of repository capacity, what the expectations would be for, certain SBIR grantees who might, have sort of statutory exemptions, to actually allow them to sort of withhold data for a certain period of time, and how to handle, sort of qualitative data that might be, somewhat different than the sort of standard biomedical researcher data that we might be talking about in most cases. Next slide, please. We've also gotten a number of questions on cost. So, and to some extent, I think some of these may be addressed through the sort of supplemental information, on cost. But certainly we're paying, careful attention to these to see if there's, an area where we may be able to sort of help clarify things for people, further than what's already out there. So there's certainly, I think certain questions about, allowable costs, like in particular, when is something a direct cost versus an F&A cost when it relates to data management and sharing? For example, would hiring data scientists, be sort of an allowable cost? How should we handle, cloud storage costs? Whether, grantees, should be sort of anticipating costs that might occur, after the period of performance, and sort of, how to handle costs that are associated with gaining access to the primary data that would be analyzed during the course of a study. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to conclude by sort of going into some of our kind of outreach activities and some of the other activities that we see going on right now, and then maybe we can kind of get sort of into the discussion. Next slide, please. So just as an example of some of the presentations we've given, so these are some of the sort of external talks we've done. A number of these are online for people who are sort of interested in seeing them, like the Hopkins talk, for example. We've also gotten, I think, a lot of interest from NIH advisory councils, who are also quite interested in this topic. And we are planning to do a lot more. There's a talk scheduled for Primer coming up, and there's a number of other opportunities as well. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think OSP actually supported a National Academies workshop that was really pulled together to try and help identify sort of community training and resource needs relative to the implementation of the policy, and to help try and sort of surface challenges that might be anticipated in kind of implementing the policy's expectations, as well as to kind of get a sense from the community about sort of what successful data sharing might look like and how we should try to sort of measure that. I think these were really well-attended talks that had about 2,000 participants involved at various points. Next slide, please. There's a couple of, I think, kind of key points that we certainly took from those discussions. So I think we heard pretty clearly, the thinking that implementation, requires a kind of system-wide cultural shift, and that we need to make sure that incentives and resources are sort of being aligned, not just from NIH, but sort of across the biomedical research ecosystem. So with publishers and with repositories and with associations and things like that. And then I think something else that we heard pretty clearly was that there's an interest in making sure that the data sharing that occurs as a result of this policy is impactful, and that is sort of a key thing for successful policy implementation, and that as people are going about thinking about their sort of data management practices, they really should be mindful of like how secondary users might actually use these data. And that we should be sort of collecting and analyzing data sharing metrics to understand and try and assess the value of data sharing. And the key to that will be probably greater sort of adoption of sort of data citation approaches, which again could also aid in sort of our own compliance monitoring. And at last, I think there was an important point raised about sort of trust, and in sort of particular trying to the importance of establishing trust with the communities whose data will actually be shared under this policy. Next slide, please. We're aware of a couple of other activities going on that relate to sort of data management and sharing, and I think we're quite pleased to see that this now seems to have sort of its own momentum that's not necessarily being driven just by sort of NIH and our policies. So obviously there was a recent AAU and APLU report on this topic and a really nice webinar series about those discussions. FASEB, earlier this summer, also started their own program in this area, and I think we're really interested to see where that goes. Next slide, please. I do just want to plug here, this is not necessarily part of the policy, but it is certainly closely related to it. I think a concern that we have heard from time to time over the years is, sort of the kind of difficulty in sharing information when the informed consents that they're collected under can be written in sort of very divergent or different ways. And so in an effort to try and sort of help people with that issue, we put out for public comment a sort of draft points to consider document that includes in it examples of sample language and sort of considerations meant to help people in drafting informed consent forms to address the possibility of future use of data in biospecimens. That's currently out for public comment right now, and the public comment period closes on September 29th. We'd love to hear from you. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, we also have our own topics that I think we're sort of interested in kind of hearing from the community from, in particular, sort of what areas of policy implementation you think really should be sort of the highest priority. We're always interested in hearing that. And then I think, from that sort of, are there areas that, that this community in particular would sort of help contribute to, that would help NIH and the community writ large, actually implement the policy. And then I think, we're always interested in sort of understanding, what aspects of this policy and sort of other data sharing policies people consider to be administratively burdensome to comply with, and whether there are, sort of reasonable strategies to help try and reduce the burden of, complying with our policy expectations. Next slide, please. Okay, well, so I will stop it there. This slide includes on it sort of a list, of the policy and the supplemental information and sort of where they were published, and a address at the bottom that if we don't get to anything today, we're sort of always happy to receive feedback at this address as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy and Taunton, for that great presentation. A lot of really helpful information and background on the policy development and your plans for implementation. A lot of attendees have been popping some questions in the Q&A. So starting with you, we'll start hitting you with these hard-hitting questions. Just a comment to the attendees that we are, in the interest of time, trying to kind of combine some questions where it seems like there are questions along the same theme. And we, of course, will also have a copy of all of the questions after the session. So if you've posed a question and we don't answer it kind of just the way you asked it, or we don't have time to address that comment or question during the session, we'll do our best to try to pull together some responses afterwards. So just to start off with, I think the one that is near and dear to so many administrators' hearts is one related to cost. Will NIH produce additional costing guidance in the near future? Is NIH considering raising the cap of modular awards? And I think that's one question we received from a couple different attendees, the potential to raise the cap of modular awards to accommodate the cost of data sharing.
Great, thanks. So I'll take sort of the first part of this, and then I will turn it over to my colleague Cindy to perhaps respond more fully. But as I think I indicated, certainly we're aware that there's kind of a lot of questions about this and a lot of interest in resources. So we're really taking a look at where we might be able to say things that might be helpful for kind of clarifying what the policy expects. Obviously, there's already the sort of supplemental information for allowable costs. I think people still have some questions, even sort of with that, and obviously sometimes the government can often be sort of limited in what we're sort of able to say to people. But we're certainly interested in seeing where we might be able to provide guidance to people that would be kind of most helpful, perhaps down to the level of kind of like what can be included in some of these categories in terms of the specific kinds of things that I think people are routinely running into, for example. So I will turn it over to Cindy now.
And for the specific question about the modular budget and whether that needs to be raised to accommodate these costs, we don't have specific plans for that at this point, but we do have some time to explore this. Just a reminder, the policy is not effective till 2023, so don't be scared. It's not this coming January. So we are thinking through exactly what approaches are needed and how we can make sure things are straightforward so institutions know what to do about these costs.
Yeah, and I'll just say also,
really quick. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Just to add to that, I think also we're hoping really to learn from sort of the first year of experience with the policy as well. So, it can be hard to sort of figure out what's going to be a reasonable cost when people haven't really been submitting these to us before. So, I think there's certainly a kind of expectation that we will have a bit of a learning experience in the beginning as well.
A really quick plug as well for the finance audit and costing session tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern, where we'll also be discussing some of the challenges of looking at, can we include these costs as F&A, or what can be included as direct costs, and teasing apart some of those costing questions. So anyone who's interested in the costing aspects, we encourage you to join that session as well.
The second question is multi-part. Will NIH be providing a list of acceptable repositories that can be used for depositing data? This individual has heard that NIH is developing a website that will host useful information, including data management plans for ICs, and they want to know what the timeline is for that, and will stakeholders have an opportunity to provide input?
Thanks. That's a great question. So first off, I'll just say right now we don't necessarily immediately have plans to provide like a list of NIH approved repositories. There are going to be some cases where the NIH Institute and Center funding the work, or the specific program that the work is being conducted under, will identify a specific actual repository, or perhaps a set of repositories that can be used. So as I was mentioning, under the GDS policy, there's a set of repositories that can be used. And so the policy itself doesn't point to any one repository, but it certainly provides characteristics that can be used to identify repositories, and that should, I think, really help people to actually kind of point to these ones. And then in terms of a sort of a general resource, I think perhaps not just limited to like list of repositories or things, but other kinds of resources. We definitely anticipate that there will be something public facing that will be available with a lot of resources on it. Things like FAQs, I can say quite confidently that we will be providing those on a number of topics under the policy, as well as other resources. And I think our goal really is to make some of these things available for the community in a way that is compatible with their submitting applications for the January 25th, 2023 receipt date.
Thank you. The next question is, if the data is supposed to be shared as soon as possible at the end of the grant, what is the suggested practice to protect the research staff, or the research lab, from getting scooped by another university or another group? And then is it possible to do an embargo period until they can perfect the publication?
That's a great question too. So the policy doesn't explicitly get into the issue of embargo periods and what might be permissible there. And it does try and prescribe, I think, a fairly limited set of reasons for why data should be made available in a more limited fashion. So for ethical, technical, or sort of legal reasons. I think this is an issue that we're sort of interested in addressing, in part through ensuring better incentives are in place, to make people want to share data, so that this isn't as much of a concern. I think the sort of other part of that as well is ensuring that people can receive appropriate, recognition for when they do generate and share data, and for when those data are used, perhaps through things like finding mechanisms for more data citation, and to ensure. And this is not just for NIH, although it is relevant for NIH, but it's something that I think has to occur outside NIH as well. Finding ways to make sure that that recognition gets factored into sort of career decisions that are sort of actually made in this space, so that people can actually advance on the sharing of their data.
Thanks.
All right. I wonder if this one is one that you might hear somewhat commonly. And I think we had a couple attendees pose kind of similar questions on this same theme. Is there a method for adjudicating disagreements in cases where NIH program staff may think that data is shareable, but the IRB feels that it may not be shareable due to consent or privacy concerns? And kind of a very similar, what if there is a disagreement between the PI and PO regarding the requirements that are appropriate to be included in the data management plan, or whether or not resulting activity is compliant with the spirit of the plan?
So we haven't laid out, I think, a specific process for how one would sort of, adjudicate disagreements, particularly when you have an external IRB saying that they can't sign off on something because, it wouldn't be appropriate to share it. In general, I think NIH, is not really in the business of challenging institutions' IRBs. And so, where there are sort of, valid ethical concerns, I think, we certainly would need to honor those. In particular, if things like the consent say these data cannot be shared, that I think is certainly something that we would generally consider to be an acceptable reason that would limit sharing to some degree. There may be other cases as well. But yeah, we haven't gotten to the point yet of sort of, putting out a specific like appeals process or anything like that for how this would be handled. Cindy, did you have any thoughts on that you want to offer?
Nothing concrete at this point, just that we are aware of the need to really put into place good processes to ensure that expectations are known to everyone and that it's really clear what to include and what's going to be looked at when they're assessed and approved. But yeah, I would just echo Taunton that in general, NIH is not going to try and argue with any, institutional decisions like that. But we will be considering what processes and workflows to put into place to make this as straightforward as possible.
Okay, our next question. When the NIH is referring to data, do they mean individual data points must be shared, or does this refer to aggregate data?
So I think what's most important to keep in mind here, this policy is going to apply to essentially the whole NIH portfolio. We're obviously talking about enormous diversity of fields and studies that we might be talking about, and data types as well. What really matters here is the definition of scientific data. So it's those data that are necessary to validate and replicate the research findings. And that's what's going to determine sort of whether it's the data that we expect to be shared or not. In some cases, that may be summary level data. In other cases, that may be a much more granular level of data.
The next question is, what are the costs associated with existing NIH repositories, and can you use those to satisfy the data sharing plan management?
So I don't want to get into whether those specific repositories will or will not satisfy the policy, but I will say that in general, NIH repositories are typically free. I actually can't think of any examples that are supported by NIH that would charge. And I think a lot of repositories do tend to operate on a similar basis, especially when they are supported by an external source of funding. But there are obviously many repositories out there that do charge for services as well. And I assume that meant charge for submission of data, not charge for access to data.
I would assume that as well, charge for the submission rather than charge for access.
And for NIH, in both cases, it would generally speaking be free.
So another probably common question that you receive, and I think related a little bit to another one, a lot of concern about IC-specific data sharing requirements and being able to anticipate those requirements before you get to the just-in-time phase, and you're hearing from a program officer that it's not consistent with that IC's expectations. So how will IC-specific data sharing requirements, including any specific expectations regarding particular repositories to be used, be coordinated across NIH and hopefully posted in a single location to be accessed by investigators and institutions?
Yeah, so I don't want to, say anything too specific right now, but I will just say that, we are certainly aware of the fact that there is a complex, increasingly complex landscape at NIH when it comes to data sharing expectations. And we need to provide some degree of flexibility, across the agency to make sure that certain, programmatic goals can be met. But at the same time, I think we have it as a very high priority implementation item for us that we want to really reduce the complexity, and the burden of complying with these different expectations. And I can say, just using the sort of genomic data sharing policy as an example, we are taking a very hard look at what we can do to absolutely minimize, sort of areas where there might be, confusing kind of differences, or possibly sort of redundant requirements, and that this is an approach that we intend to take to the greatest extent possible across the agency as well. And that can include things like providing resources in a central location to help people understand what they might be subject to.
Okay. One more question, and I think this is, getting at the heart of the mission of the FDP. What steps has NIH considered for reducing the burden of compliance with this policy, such as creation of templates, improved data access requests, common data use agreements? Oh, it's a person near and dear to my data transfer and use agreement heart prior to implementation of the policy?
That's a great question. And so it's interesting too, because it addresses not just what I think is the focus of this policy, which is sort of the data management and sharing, which, I think this policy really kind of stops short of sort of talking about the data access side, where people would be requesting access to data. But I will say, I think we have spent a lot of time and effort thinking about how we can absolutely minimize administrative burden. In particular, I'll say, the situation that sometimes arises with policies that I don't really want to see repeated in this case, is where people have to undertake a kind of intellectual exercise, to sort of figure out what, the expectations are that, apply to them, and what they're actually supposed to do. To the extent that people are sort of thinking deeply about their requirements under this policy, I really want them to focus it in filling out what they're going to do under their data management and sharing plan, and not thinking about things like, does this policy apply to me in the first place? So we really want to make sure that all of those sort of other steps are as absolutely minimized as possible. And we are definitely looking at resources that we can develop that will make that easier. I think to some extent, the sort of data management and sharing plan, elements that we sort of issued, it's not a template. We're not asking people to like fill it out, but it is pretty close to a template. And I think gets at us wanting to have sort of a standardizer process there as we can. And I will speak to the access side as well, because this is also actually an area of a lot of interest for my division in the Office of Science Policy. And we are currently undertaking an effort to look at controlled access mechanisms across the agency, and to see what we might be able to do in order to sort of make things easier, both in terms of accessibility and findability, but also just in sort of the burden of actually getting access, and things like standard data use agreements, are certainly an area that we are very interested in. And I should clarify that I mean interested in that, not just from the perspective of getting access to data, but rather the submission of data, from awardees to repositories as well.
Well, it just so happens, Taunton, that the FDP might have produced a standardized data use agreement template. I mean, I'm just saying. Anyway.
There was a question to see if you guys can expand upon what would be used by NIH to help evaluate whether or not the costs associated with a data management plan is reasonable.
Cindy, do you want to take this one?
I can start off. I will say that I think Taunton mentioned previously that we're trying to do as much as we can to provide information on that would make it able to assess what is a reasonable cost. But part of this is going to have to involve looking at experience after this policy goes into effect, what costs are actually being included in applications, so we can have kind of an evidence base to look at to refine things in the future. But there has been some work. Taunton, I don't know if you want to comment on the National Academy's efforts to inform estimating costs or any other aspects of that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, there was that National Academy study that we helped support actually through a National Library of Medicine as well, and that has, I think, some useful findings in it for kind of thinking about costs. I think especially over time. Certainly, there are things like cost estimator tools that are out there, and we are sort of looking at them and seeing what's available and accessible to people right now, and thinking about sort of what might need to exist in the future to sort of make things easier for people. But this is an area that I think is going to evolve a lot, especially as more experience comes in. And it's kind of interesting too, because this is a new policy. So obviously it's really difficult to sort of estimate things, before people start kind of doing them. But people have actually been sharing data for a long time and, submitting data to repositories for a long time. And so there is actually, I think, a lot of information out there. It's just that people have perhaps not been pursuing it in any kind of standardized or, systematic way in the past. So, this is an area where we're, I think, always interested in kind of more information as well.
There was also another question that's actually a very unique one. It's about export control interplay on how data sharing and data management can be, and whether or not there's any plans to potentially, or concerns about excluded third parties from accessing data.
Yeah, so this is a topic that I think has been getting a lot of attention, particularly like in the media lately. Export controls are a type of law. It's a type of legal limitation that may exist on the sharing of data, and certainly the policy recognizes when there are laws that might limit the degree of sharing that's accessible to some to some degree. As it relates, I think, more generally to sort of sharing, with kind of foreign entities when there aren't necessarily export controls that come into play. I think that's a somewhat different matter, and in general, NIH has tried to make our resources as sort of openly accessible to as many parties as possible.
So I think this one is a little bit more worded as a comment, but I wonder, Taunton and Cindy, if you guys would have any thoughts in response to this comment. It's going back to the issue of scooping, and how that in many ways can come down to an issue of equity. Because larger institutions versus smaller institutions, those larger institutions have the ability to throw more staff or graduate students, to get the publication out sooner, whereas smaller institutions with fewer resources may take a little bit longer to get that first publication out.
That's a great point. And actually at the National Academies workshop this spring, there was, I think, a lot of discussion about equity. And not just from the perspective of like big versus small institutions, but in terms of who's doing the research, whose data are being shared. That was, I think, a very common theme there. I think, again, this comes down to a question of making sure that we are putting in place appropriate mechanisms for people to see, to actually get recognition for their work, and that when they get that recognition, they are sort of appropriately compensated for it. So I think there's definitely work to do here. That's for sure. And I'm certainly interested in sort of hearing more about, where there might be, concerns or expectations around this. But I think from our perspective, there's a number of ways that, both inside NIH and outside NIH, people can do things to try and sort of help address that concern.
Another question that kind of goes along with export control is there is some concerns about whether or not there's going to be European-based sites that would be contributing data, and how that GDPR it would interplay with the data sharing and management plans.
Yeah, so the policy doesn't say U.S. laws only. I think certainly we have to recognize that we have partners, around the world that will be subject to laws that they can't necessarily ignore. And obviously GDPR has posed some pretty substantial challenges for us as an agency in terms of maintaining our collaborations with European partners. It's a trend that I think, unfortunately, is also not limited to Europe, and that we're seeing in a number of other countries as well. And so this is, I think, an area of sort of ongoing discussion in sort of how best to manage this. I think we are hopeful that in the GDPR context, there may be future clarifications coming from the European side about what's sort of permissible, and that might be able to help address some of these concerns. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a problem, and it's not, unfortunately, it's not something that we in this country have a lot that we can do other than to make decisions sort of upfront about how what is sort of valuable in terms of sharing data, knowing what we know about GDPR going into a study.
So we saved this one for last because we thought it would be a good closing discussion, and that maybe we could share some of our institutional perspective on this as well. But if you had a genie or a magic wand, and you could tell institutions what we should be doing right now to get ready for compliance, because I think you talk a lot about this being a cultural shift, and it is, and those don't happen. Sometimes those even take longer than the 16 months or so that we have left. So, if you had your wishes, what would you suggest institutions should be doing now to get ready?
Well, so I'll take the first response, and then I'll let Cindy also answer. But so I think from my perspective, part of any new policy, there's always challenge in making sure that everybody knows what the policy says and what the institution's implementation of that policy is going to be and going to look like, and who they should talk to understand what that is. So I certainly think internal awareness raising and things like training is a really good way for institutions to figure out how their staff, their faculty are what they're going to need in order to implement the policy, because it's very difficult to anticipate that if you don't know exactly what it is that the policy says. And so I tend to think that focusing, especially at this stage, and making sure that everybody knows that this is coming, especially because of the sort of scope and breadth of this policy, that's a really good starting point at this point. Cindy?
Not really much to add. That I think that's a great answer. Just I'll add that while we don't have all of the details of exactly how this will all work, we do have the policy requirements, which are really two things: knowing that you'll need to submit a plan, and we already know what information should be included there, and an institutional awareness that a budget is going to be part of this. This is something you'll need to consider. So I think that, and just understanding what, raising awareness and communicating within your institution, knowing that this is what's needed, and more details will certainly come as they're available to help you all down that pathway.
So I'll say that one of the things that we're trying to do at our institution now is, as you said, just raise awareness, but also encourage researchers to start using something like the DMP tool to develop a data management plan now, even when they're not required to, so that that very first time they try to think through all of the questions included in pulling one of those together isn't 5 days and 1 minute before they need to submit that first application. I say that because many institutions have something like 5 days of a deadline where proposals are due to their central offices for review. So, you know, we've tried to publicize the availability of some tools like DMP tool and encouraging researchers to start thinking about pulling those plans together now. I don't know if Chris or Jen, is there anything you guys can think of that you guys are starting to work on at your institutions now to get ready?
Similar to yours, I think we're just trying to get the word out and keep everyone posted on the new requirements coming in, and for them to think about it critically as they're preparing their presentations or their submissions.
Raising awareness seems to be the name of the game. And, you know, the cost seems to be the kind of the other, you know, number one big thing that everyone is thinking about, and thinking about how this fits within our, you know, F&A strategy and F&A model. Oh, I see. Sorry, I see a question in the chat to post a link to the DMP tool, which I will do. But we're coming to the end of our time here. And Cindy and Tom, I don't know if there's any last comments that you wanted to make, or if we should turn it over to David for his final statements.